Is Islamic traditionalism rational and relevant? It is understandable why some Muslims view the modern/Western academic study of Islam with suspicion, while others look down on traditionalist study as some relic of the past. Both mindsets are, at some level, justified, and both are reductionist. It is wrong to assert that it must be one or the other way, for both have pros and cons. The traditional study is the bedrock of a Muslim's Islamic education. Rigorous training in the Arabic language, connecting with fiqh and usul tradition by studying a madhab school, learning orthodox Islamic theology, and then moving on to hadith studies, like in the Nizamiyya curriculum, cannot be overemphasized for understanding Islam at a fundamental level. However, there are limitations. The texts studied are often pre-modern and ancient. Although one may acquire a sound traditional understanding of the disciplines, most traditional seminaries, their curriculums by and large, are silent, or at least amateur in their teachings on how to effectively fuse traditional knowledge with the newly developed understanding of Islam, which seems more logical and rational. For example, traditional theology and usul texts are often centered around discussions of traditional or classical logic and textual formalism. Factors like a priori empirical and scientific knowledge and logical plurality are usually missing. The concept of coherence in epistemology as opposed to strict formalism/traditionalism is not thoroughly discussed and applied to arguments. When one presents traditional theology with weak empirical and scientific justification or in a strict formalist/traditionalist way, focusing on epistemic regress to bolster the arguments, he will disconnect from global intellectual culture that is usually scientifically and technologically literate, or even over-literate, used to relativistic, non-formalist/traditionalist construction of knowledge, and study in universities where classical/traditional logic is now outdated and mostly replaced by inferential knowledge. Many seminaries also have problems in their educational culture, where pre-colonial understandings of Islamic subjects are presented as epistemically and socially authoritative. It might sound like a small problem, but it interacts with and teaches the average Muslim outside of a little religious circle, and it becomes evident that he is missing a conceptual and sociological bridge connecting traditional knowledge to current issues and circumstances. The root of this issue lies in the 20th century Mu'tazila rationalism. It is neither philosophical liberalism nor progressive but moderate, Quranic term middle way. Islam, as the Quran declares. Revivalists claim that traditionalism is anti-Quranic, so they present 5 general and 4 specific arguments to prove their case. General terms are better paradigm, historical, Quranic, rational, and family-oriented. Specific ones are: sex is allowed with concubines only after marrying them. There is no punishment for apostasy enunciated in the Quran. War of aggression is not permissible. Enslavement of cows is not allowed. Revivalists or modernists, unlike traditionalists, claim that the Quran is clear and accessible. The traditionalists, on the other hand, consider that the Quran is dim, ambiguous, and incomplete without hadith and traditions. It leads to an infinite regress of interpretation of the interpreter, for there was no critique or scrutiny of the early companion hadith narrators, rendering the authenticity of their narrated hadith questionable. There was also no established criterion for consensus, ijma', so making it based on circular logic. Islamic revivalists claim to be originalists using the latest historical critical scholarship method to figure out the preaching of historical Muhammad and the teachings of Allah, SWT, in Quran. Traditionalists follow century-old traditions about sex without marriage and rely on post-Quranic sources, diverging from Quran and the Prophet, so none of such traditions are traceable back to God or His Messenger. Traditionalists back-project the sectarian and culturally situated ideas onto the Prophet. Modern Muslim scholars and Western historians agree that classical commentaries are full of imaginative and improbable reading where exegeses concoct meanings from themselves. Some Muslim scholars noted that they never allowed Quran to speak for itself but through later traditions, especially hadith corpus. The hadith, the most problematic source, is full of forgeries and historical anachronism. Some even contradict or radically depart from Quranic injunctions. This skepticism of traditionalism started from the early times of Islam. Mu'tazila. Modernists believe that unauthentic and contradictory ahadith should not be relied upon for deriving pivotal logical beliefs but the Qur'an unless these conform with Qur'an, human reason, and the science of historical critical method. Revivalists also believe that the ahadith related to sex with the concubines, slave girls, are full of mass fabrication and anachronism based on the circular logic of consensus. Thus, the so-called consensus gains more credibility than the Quranic injunctions. The traditionalists say, if a Quranic verse opposes our view, we simply consider it abrogated, reinterpret it, or reject it. Ernest Renan. It is a medieval tradition to use the hadith to cover up such deviations. According to traditionalists, Qur'an has not come to rule over Sunnah, but the Sunnah came to rule over Qur'an. Imam Ghazali endorsed this view. Dr. Jonathan Brown, a Muslim scholar, noted how, in traditionalism Qur'an needs Sunnah more than Sunnah needs Qur'an, and that an interpreter or a qazi of the court has all the power to interpret Qur'an. An interpreter exegesis gives meaning to verses warranted by the culture, ruler, time, and school he follows. Both Hanafi and Shafi'i follow this tradition. A Sunni scholar Yahya ibn Sa'id Khattan says, I have not seen more dishonest salihin in any field than in sectarianism and hadith. Imam Hanbal said, debate, arguments and rational theology are all forbidden. Ibn Khattamah said, rational theology and philosophy are all bad, and logic is haram. Qur'an, from the revivalist point of view, embraces legal minimalism, whereas traditionalism embraces legal maximalism. Traditionalists follow the letter of the law based on hadith and traditions. Fideism doctrine defines that the faith is independent of reason as they are hostile to each other. Epistemological theory. Imam Hanbal is an anti-intellectual figure who postulated that God appears as a young boy with curly hair and has a penis. Ibn Taymiyyah agreed. In the 15th century, Ibn Sayyid and the Grand Mufti of Saudi Arabia, Ibn Baz, believed in the flat earth. Modernists credit Caliph Umar for breaking away from traditionalism as a moral and ethical objectivist, deviating from misinterpreted Qur'an and Sunnah, taking into consideration moral and ethical reasons, and changing circumstances. He adopted changes in zakat distribution, arms distribution, and war spoil distribution. He forbade mut'a marriage and public intoxication. He also stopped cutting off the hands of thieves due to drought. He allowed protection for slave women. According to revivalists, he followed the intent/spirit of Qur'an and avoided being a literalist or traditionalist. Traditionalists rely on a hadith, regardless of authenticity, and develop laws based on local practices, schools of thought followed, and consensus, trumping Qur'an and teachings of the Prophet, rendering them less than fiqh, hadith, school, and ijma'. Many Muslim scholars agree that in the first 150 to 200 years of Islam, there were no historians who recorded the history, and events were carried over by the narrators, from their memories, poets, storytellers, devout companions, and companions of companions who memorized the text and hadith corpus, hadith and sunnah, using akhbari ahad, and ijma'. Modernists think that historically, early traditionalism was a product of the emulation and influence of Greco-Roman, Zoroastrian, Persian, Christian, and Jewish laws. Consequently, it promoted anti-apostasy laws, slavery, sexual relations with concubines without marriage, pederasty, veiling, etc., therefore, sticking to medieval, imperial, and atrocious traditionalism. Traditionalism, nevertheless, was not a static, immovable entity. To follow the traditional path does not mean to be stuck in the past. Traditional knowledge progressed as time went on. Al-Razatu al-Ghazali, Izzuddin ibn Abdi Salam, and Al-Qarafi launched a whole new discipline of Qawaid al-Fiqh. Imam al-Nawawi reformatted the Shafi'i school, and Shah Waliullah al-Dila'i attempted to synthesize Aqli and Naqli, Hanafi, and Shafi'i perspectives. A greater emphasis on primary evidence yielded tremendous insight into Islamic history that was previously either unknown or overlooked. Highly valued are Muslim institutions that attempt to combine the strengths of each, traditionalist and modernist, and eliminate their drawbacks as much as possible. To date, few such institutions exist, and prominent examples are Ibn Khaldun University in Istanbul and the International Islamic Universities in Islamabad and Kuala Lumpur. Some institutions in the West, like Darul Qasim and Zaytuna in the USA and Ibrahim College in the UK, are also putting in effort to bring the best of both worlds together. Studying Islam via the modern academic method has its advantages and disadvantages. The methods of studying history are much more rigorous. Of course, this does not mean that modern and especially Western academic study is without error. The intensely secular character of Western academic study neuters the native spirituality of Islamic learning. Constantly being exposed to an environment in which discussion of religious concepts is not rooted in God consciousness or spiritual adab is poisonous to a Muslim's ontology and religious psychology. Hardened traditionalism seems to be a replica of Abbasid, Umayyad tyrannical authoritarianism and utilitarianism replacing godliness and piety through dictatorial caliphates. When it is said to the traditionalists to follow what Allah has revealed in Qura'an, they say no. We will follow what our ulama, forefathers/Islams, followed with consensus. Q. 2:170 and Q. 25:30. Traditionalists argue that the HCM was devised in the 19th century primarily to undermine Judaic and Christian traditions and later extended to Islamic traditions. They quote that, according to some Western scholars, the Islamic records, texts and literature, are traceable back to Qur'an and Prophet Muhammad, so Islam is mostly accurate. Ernest Renan, Theodore Noldeek, and Julius Wellhausen. Critical approaches like these yield new insights, and not just in history. Consider how profoundly manuscript study using modern archaeological techniques has contributed to our understanding of the Quran's preservation. Muhammad Mustafa al-Azami's classic history of the Quranic text is timeless not just because of his traditional background but also because of tools of critical analysis and historical methods acquired from Western academia. The same goes for other important works like Jonathan Brown's canonization of Bukhari and Muslim and Ahmed el-Shamsi's canonization of Islamic law. One of the greatest strengths of Western academia is its curiosity and openness to novelty. It's not enough to settle for what is known, for there is always something unknown to discover. Upon reflection, one may realize that, new understanding and knowledge cannot be produced without such an approach. This openness, when combined with a critical attitude, can help expand Islamic knowledge and its applicability. Traditionalists also defend their position by explaining that HCM, historical critical method, is ineffective because most doctrines were crafted much later, after the times of Moses, Jesus, and even Buddha, so these cannot be related to them, hence were back-projected onto them by the modernists to justify their claims. HCM ignored the biological, psychological, and quantitative social sciences, factors, beliefs, and norms shared by the Prophet Muhammad with his Muslim followers, providing a vast amount of information about earlier Muslims and their behavior regarding sexual relations, slavery, war, etc. They also explain that before Islam, 4 kinds of societies existed, and these are, 1. Pastoral, 2. Hunter-gatherers, 3. Agricultural, and 4. Patrilineal. Muslims mainly lived in pastoral patrilineal societies. A methodological problem with HCM scholarship is that it emerged in the 18th century during the Enlightenment and philosophical liberalism period geared at scientific and human rights advancement by destroying traditionalism. Thank you for using Panopreter Basic. Liberal reform movement first destroyed the Jewish and Christian traditions, then turned to Islamic traditions to promote monogamy and homosexuality, attacking hijab as the oppression of women, and there is no need to be scared of hell like children. They accused God of injustice and evil in the world to do away with the punishment in the hereafter and adhere to objective morality. There have also been some Muslim proponents of this misguided liberalism, like Sir Sayyid Ahmed Khan, Muhammad Abduh, Kamal Ataturk, and Jamal Nasser, who caused more harm to Islam than to traditionalism, which is still standing strong among the Malvi-dependent so-called nominal Muslims. This assertion was challenged in 1970 by John Winsborough, Patricia Corona, and Michael Cook 1970 on the basis that Islamic text, literature, was collected/compiled roughly 100 years after the death of the Prophet and that people forget a lot and the doctrines changed. Their premise rests on three things. 1. Muhammad and Mecca did not exist. 2. Qura'an and hadith are an amalgamation of Arabic literature compiled over time after the life of the Prophet. 3. The basic Islamic accounts of the Prophet's life and career are just mythologies, so they must resort to other than Islamic datable inscriptions from before 750 years for their investigation. Traditionalists assert that although the carbon dating of the Qur'an and 7th century Christian accounts confirm the existence of Prophet Muhammad and HCM miserably failed so, modernists moved on to the criticism of hadith and traditions. Traditionalists, however, praise HCM claiming that it has done a good service by confirming the Jewish and Christian literature developed over time after the lives of their prophets. Another weakness of the HCM is the language. Its practitioners are not well trained in interdisciplinary studies of language and its biological and psychological foundations. Without knowing the intent of the author/interpreter, prophet, the belief, conduct, mode, etc., there is ample scope for misunderstanding the historical facts. Many Quranic injunctions are explained and understood through hadith, so their elimination is impossible. Halal meat, wine drinking, 5 prayers, etc. There is plenty of evidence to show how the beliefs and norms of the Prophet are consistent with traditionalism. HCM practitioners use different sources inconsistently by proposing that early Islam was ecumenical following Jewish and Christian ways of salvation who wanted to conquer Jerusalem city, so do Muslims, Fred Donner. Traditionalists argue that Jews and Christians were extremely sectarian to even think of being united to conquer Jerusalem city, so intellectually, it is not a convincing argument. Modernists use the cooperation between all three religions against traditionalist exclusivism of Islam but fail to mention Muslims breaking crosses, destroying synagogues, and taking jizya from non-Muslims. Modernists dismiss these facts as isolated exceptions and post hoc reasoning. Thirdly, HCM academics use archaeological data, radiocarbon dating or manuscripts paleography but ignore the inscriptions and other artifacts because of similarity. Modernists, however, contend that traditionalists, nevertheless, miserably failed to counter the misogynistic statements by Muslim scholars, Ashraf Ali Thanvi is one, and those present in Hadith corpus, and that they also failed to promote the ontological gender equality enshrined in Qur'an. A marriage contract is considered a sale contract, buying a vagina and the refund of dowry by a khula-seeking woman, the ransom for freeing her vagina, called bud in Islamic literature. Revivalists/modernists also claim on the strength of Q. 425 that sexual relations with a slave woman are not allowed without marriage. No fornication or love affair, permissible, but after paying mahr, bride wealth. And that sexual relations with slave girls and pederasty are pre-modern Islamic sexual debauchery. Muhammad Asad, a Muslim scholar, affirms that the above verse reiterates the prohibition of concubinage by denouncing it as whoredom. Some Mu'tazila scholars agreed with the modernists' point of view, and Caliph Ali was also not in favor of free sexual relations with slave women. Maryam al-Qibtiyya was a slave woman who bore a son to the Prophet. Presumably, the Prophet married her, otherwise, she would not have conferred with the status of the mother of the faithful. Revivalists assert that pre-modern Islamic traditions violate the Quranic ethics by going against the teaching of Qur'an and women's rights. Patricia Corona assumes that apostasy and blasphemy laws in Islam come from the Roman and Persian laws. Mu'tazila used ethical reasoning in interpreting texts because Muslims have rational interpretive choices. Traditionalists, on the other hand, quote verse Q. 225 for women having rights similar to their obligations and that Noah and Lot's wives were under them. Q66:10. They also invoke worldwide patriarchal traditions, gender role, in vogue from pre-Islamic times, managing women activities and their place in a hierarchical setting. In substantiation, they refer to archaeological sources, inscriptions found in the Arabian Peninsula, showing no reference to any female. They accuse modernists of trying to do away with the family structure and values by presenting Qura'an against patriarchy through their goofy gymnastics. Traditionalists argue that the psychological and biological makeup of human beings, their behavior, and neuroscientific studies are critical in understanding the beliefs and norms of the earlier Muslims. They also further the male-guarding tendency of women as an acceptance and relevance of patriarchy and that, according to data, pastoral and agricultural societies are highly patriarchal, necessitating more children, multiple wives, and a larger group of people. Sexual relation restrictions upon women became necessary due to the long-term absence of males due to their lifestyle. In the present time, and most likely in the future, such rustic thinking and reasoning for disciplining well-aware and independent women would fail miserably. According to my understanding, Islam is not an egalitarian but an elitist religion that adopts egalitarianism as and when necessary, like at the time of Hajj, pilgrimage to Mecca, and human dignity, etc. Islam does make mention of the hierarchical system as well as the specification of roles, including gender roles, without indicating any sense of equality, in a secular or Western sense, due to biological and psychological differences. Modernists consider the default position of Qur'an on the sanctity of human life. Thank you for using Panopreter Basic. Traditionalists, on the other hand, consider the sanctity of the life of a Muslim only and provisionally of those under a treaty. Jihad. Establishing and spreading Islam through jihad, evangelism, is also a widely misunderstood concept by traditionalists. It is vehemently being debunked and challenged by current scholars. Islam, because of its divine character, cannot allow a war of aggression. The doctrine of Qisas categorically refutes it. Allah also does not like aggressors. Q2:190. Enslaving people was the tradition of Pharaoh adopted by the traditionalists, considering non-Muslims as dead so they could be enslaved or killed. Abu Bakr started taking women and children as prisoners, but many companions objected to it. Imam Malik and Imam Abu Hanifa. Shafi'i came up with the idea that non-Muslim women and children captured in the war should not be killed for financial, utilitarian, reasons as they constitute property and property ought not be destroyed. Later on, traditionalists added a ridiculous analogy that taking prisoners is like animals do in a group conflict for survival, resources, territory, and reproduction. Caliph Umar issued the order that no Arab shall be captured and held as a prisoner of war. Later Caliph Ali extended it to non-Arabs. Prophet in his times freed all his slaves and freed all prisoners of war. After the War of Yunnan, no one was captured and held as a prisoner of war. Some traditionalists take refuge in the Old Testament and Hebrew Bible, which endorse the conquest of other lands and genocide of its people, like that of Canaanites and Malachites by King David. It is, nevertheless, an accepted fact that women's mistreatment had been commonplace in almost all societies, such as Greco-Roman, Judaic, Christian, Zoroastrian, Hindu, Byzantine, Sassanid, Babylonian, Assyrian, Mesopotamian, and Buddhist. They all prevented women from getting an education, marrying people of other groups, from trade and out-of-home activities. Traditionalists use this historical mistreatment of women to justify analogous Islamic administration/control of women's affairs. Not allowing women to go for Hajj without a permissible relative was also enacted, although Aisha, R.A., performed Hajj after the death of the Prophet without a muhrim. A woman was appointed as an imam of a mosque in Medina by the Prophet, whose muezzin, caller for prayer, was a male. Muslim women were also later prevented from marrying out of the group, especially non-Muslims. although some of the Prophet's daughters were initially married to non-Muslims. Aisha, R.A., was also engaged to a non-Muslim before marrying the Prophet. I believe Abu Bakr and Umar were instrumental in the enactment of this very restriction. Neither there is any incontrovertible literature available on this topic, nor does Qura'an talk about it. From the Prophet's time, there exists no literature or traditions about punishment against homosexuality, so Khulafa were perplexed when faced with such offenses and, therefore, resorted to ijtihad. Since Qura'an talks about men approaching men with lust instead of women, some of the Shia scholars do accept consensual anal sexual activity with one's wife, quoting Quranic verses in which Prophet Lot offered his daughters to the invaders, Q. 11:78, and the verse approach your tilth when or how ye will, Q. 2:223. Maybe that is why, surprisingly, Imam Abu Hanifa has been very soft on Malbi's child molestation and warranted just a warning or ear twisting of the offender. He also does not equate paid sex with a woman with zina, considering the amount paid synonymous to mahar, bride wealth, so, it does away with zina, hudud, punishment in such a situation. Traditionalists previously have been vehemently against oral sex between spouses but now have come around and started accepting it as permissible. Apostasy laws and blasphemy laws, although enacted in the earliest civilizations, were formalized in Islam by misconstruing Abu Bakr's laws against hypocrites and political traitors. Capital punishment for apostates was introduced by the Abbasid rulers. Prophet Muhammad never punished an apostate or a blasphemer in his time except for hypocrite traitors. Imam Shafi'i and a 5th century scholar endorsed this view. Muslims' cooperation with other religions or interfaith dialogues does not make Islam a pluralistic or inclusivistic religion. The inclusion of people from all walks of life, ethnicities, and cultural backgrounds in its fold does. Important note. I, as a student of Islamic studies, strongly support the idea of reinterpretation of the text in the light of the collective sense of the verses on the topic, the context of the verses, the latest scientific and biological developments, application of reason, and the changed circumstances, where permissible. There should be limited use of the hadith and sunan, of those strictly conforming with Quranic injunctions, in general and specific matters. We Muslims, at the same time, ought to be on guard against religious chauvinism by the so-called Modernists and revivalists. Above all, develop the habit of self-study and research rather than believing amalgamates. Avoid pseudo-scholars produced by TV channels and Western-educated people who often assume that they have the right, knowledge, and authority to talk about Islam also. Unfortunately, nowadays, many West-educated returnees have embarked on enlightening unsuspecting, innocent people of South Asian countries, especially India, Pakistan, and Bangladesh. So be careful and do not believe them without verification from genuine sources. Always condemn and discourage when a traditionalist insults a modernist or vice versa. Stay away from sectarianism. Prophet Muhammad was a Muslim, not a Shia, not a Sunni, not a Hanafi, not a Hanbali, not a Maliki, not a Shafi'i, not a Deobandi, not a Brelvi. Quran, verse 159 of Surah Al-An'am states, those who divide their religion and form sects have nothing to do with Islam or Prophet Muhammad. Comment/share/like and follow. Shakir Mumtaz. Author, thinker, analyst. This audio file was created by Panopreter Basic. You can download it at www.panopreter.com.